Dr. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., author of the Disuniting of America, Reflections on a Multicultural Society. This is the third time this book's come out. How come?
It is the third time. It was originally published, Whittle Publishers, now extinct, did it in a kind of special edition, which was distributed free. And then W.W. Norton took it up, republished it in a trade edition. And time has passed, and the time has come to make some new points and update the rest, and hence the third version.
What's new in this one?
What's new in this one? Well, partly an updating of matters, partly some new issues have emerged, which I can tell you about, and partly because the publisher thought it'd be a good idea to have what he calls the Schlesinger syllabus at the end, a baker's dozen of books which all Americans ought to read to understand the country in which they live.
Let's talk about that. A baker's dozen, the dozen books that you've selected. Which one of all those is the most important?
Well, it's hard to say which is the most important. It's like asking which is the most important of your children, I suppose. But if pressed, one might argue that the most perceptive book written about America is still Tocqueville's Democracy in America. It's an extraordinary thing that, of course, C-SPAN has done fine work in reminding people of Tocqueville's significance. The fact that a book written 150 years ago should still illuminate the American character and the American experience is very remarkable.
You have Ralph Waldo Emerson, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Mark Twain, James Bryce, William James, Henry Adams. Henry Adams pops up in a lot of the readings that I've done for this show as The Education of Henry Adams as being one of the most important books ever written. Why is it?
Well, it's a brilliant book. I mean, he's a brilliant historian because he had some extraordinary insights. One of his insights was the increase in the velocity of history, the rate of change. He talks in The Education about the law of acceleration. And we can see this, the movement surrounds us all the time. I think Henry Adams was born just as we were reaching the end of one great structural change in our society, the shift from a farm-based to a factory-based economy. He saw that. But he anticipated, not in precise terms, but in the general sense, this shift we are now experiencing, which is a shift from a factory-based economy to a computer-based economy. He did not know about the computer, but he knew that the law of acceleration was hurtling us into a future where things would be very different.
One of your baker's dozen is Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma, 1944, and you write a lot about that in the book itself. How did you marry the two, putting it on your list and also referring to it in the book itself?
Well, Myrdal was a Swedish economist who was brought to the U.S. to study the race problem. The idea, the foundation brought him, the idea was that he could bring a certain detachment and have a certain perspective which might be useful for Americans. And it's an extraordinary book, both in the depiction of conditions half a century ago, and if you read An American Dilemma, it's hard to deny that great changes, great improvements have taken place. We haven't gone far enough, but there's extraordinary changes in American life. But he also proposed an argument as to how these changes might come about. And he identified what he called the American Creed. And he felt that the American Creed put certain ideals in the minds of Americans, ideals which were imperfectly fulfilled, often betrayed by white America. But that in the longer run, the struggle for America's soul would result in the increasing fulfillment of those ideals. And also the American Creed provided means by which those who are excluded from the full benefits of American citizenship provided means by which they could carry out a legal and constitutional fight for their rights. It's a remarkable book.
You say in this book that the U.S. has worked so far. What do you mean by that?
We have held together more or less, except of course for the Civil War. And what I meant by that was that we are in a stage with the end of the Cold War, where ancient tribal antagonisms, ethnic rivalries, and so on are bursting, which had been repressed by the Cold War, are beginning to burst out. And one nation after another is being torn apart by this. I mean, in the murderous form in Yugoslavia, where we have seen what horrors religious and national rivalries can generate. Even in a nation as tranquil and peaceful as Canada, Canada is on the verge of bust up because of differing linguistic and ethnic traditions. I think that all this suggests that that you can push, suggests that we ought to pay more attention to what holds the nation together. We're living in a time of the breaking of nations for ethnic, tribal, religious reasons. I think one reason why I wanted to revise the book, The Disuniting of America, was I think we're more sensitive now to the need to find things that hold us together than we were when the book first came out. I think the Yugoslav experience has reminded Americans that if you press ethnic rivalries too far, if you decide that people belong irrevocably to one or another ethnic community, ethnic tribe, that may be the road to trouble, and that there is some virtue in the older idea of assimilation and integration. That is, we are, after all, Americans. The melting pot has worked unevenly, it's worked imperfectly, but it has produced the ideal of one people.
The first time this book came out was 1991, then it was redone in 1992, and now in 1998. And you say in the book that history is a weapon. What do you mean by that?
History is a weapon. History is ideally strives for objectivity above the battle and so on. But historians, like everyone else, are prisoners of their own experience, their own times, and the very act of the selection of facts from the past involves an interpretation, a sense of priorities, a sense of values as to what matters. So history can be a very strong weapon for people who wish to construct a certain movement in a certain direction. History, for example, has been the victim of nationalism often. What's happening in Yugoslavia, what's happening in Ireland. George Mitchell, who did this superb job in bringing about the peace settlement in Ireland, used to say that, he once said to me, you historians are worried about the fact that young Americans don't seem to know much of their history. And I said, yes, we are baffled every once in a while, but people don't know when the Civil War took place and so on. He said, the trouble with Ireland is that they know too much of their own history, and they try to reenact it, and of course, they're filled with resentments over grievances that took place half a century ago, 300 years ago, back to Droyda and Cromwell. So that history can be a weapon in the sense of vindication of people's desire to get back at somebody else or to move in one direction or another. I think that one sees this in the construction these days of curricula, where the feeling is that people ought to be made, we ought to become proud of their ancestors. And so we get into a kind of ethnic cheerleading, which I think is at the expense of realistic history.
You know, when we sat down here, I asked you how to pronounce your name correctly. Why don't you do it one more time?
Well, I say Schlesinger. That's the German pronunciation, but it's a matter of fielder's choice. I can't even get my wife to pronounce it correctly.
But you point out, you talk about your father a couple times in this book,
yes.
And you mentioned Xenia, Ohio. Where were you born?
I was born in Columbus, Ohio. My father was born in Xenia. My father was a more eminent historian than his son. He was a great leader in the cause of social history half a century ago, the history of immigration, the history of women, He was one of the pioneers in the enlargement of history in what would be now called the multicultural direction.
What year did he die?
He died in 1965.
And what did his father do?
His father came to this country just before the Civil War as a young boy. He had a brother over here, and moved out to Xenia, Ohio.
Where did he come from?
He came from Germany.
Whereabouts in Germany?
Prussia. He was a great admirer of, he was an ardent Democrat and a great admirer of Grover Cleveland. And when my father was born in 1888, Cleveland was coming up for re-election, he wanted to name this new baby Grover Cleveland Schlesinger. Fortunately, my grandmother and my father's two older sisters intervened and saved my father from that fate. If not, I might be Grover C. Schlesinger Jr. today.
Why Xenia, Ohio? What was the draw there?
Xenia was a small, pleasant small town. It was a kind of a local, it's the county seat of Greene County in Ohio, and it seemed a thriving place. Used to have an opera house, a theater, and so on. And my grandfather liked it very much. He was a very strong supporter of education, particularly the public library. They had a Carnegie Library in Xenia.
What did he do for a living?
He was an insurance agent.
And then how did your father become a historian?
My father went to Ohio State and wanted to be a newspaper man because he'd been, when he was high school, the Xenia correspondent for a Cincinnati paper. But he did so well at Ohio State that his professors said that he should go on to graduate work at Columbia. He got a fellowship at Columbia, came on to New York, and fell under the influence of James Harvey Robinson and Charles A. Beard, and went on to become a historian.
And then how long did you spend in Columbus, Ohio?
I left Columbus, Ohio at about the age of 1, so my memories are not vivid. My father left Ohio State to go to the University of Iowa, where he became head of the history department. And then a few years later, when I was about 6 years old, Samuel Eliot Morison at Harvard became a Harmsworth professor at Oxford for a year. And he'd met my father, and he recommended that my father be brought to Cambridge as a visiting professor to take his place for that year. And so my father came to Cambridge, and after a year they offered him a permanent job too. So from the age of 6 or 7, I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
And where did you go to school?
I went to public schools. I went to Phillips Exeter Academy. I went to Harvard. I spent a year at Cambridge University.
And you've got a PhD in...
I don't have a PhD. After I spent the year, I graduated from college in 1938. Spent the year 38, 39 at Cambridge. Strange twilight year between Munich and the war. I then came back, joined something called the Society of Fellows at Harvard, which was established by a former president, A. Lawrence Lowell, who was not enthusiastic about the PhD system. So this was for people who could do what they wanted to do for a term of 3 years, so long as they didn't work for a PhD. Well, by the time my 3 years was up, we were at war, and I got involved in that. By the time I got back from overseas in 1945, I'd already written a couple of books, and there seemed no point in getting a PhD.
You've written how many books?
I forget.
There's listed out here 14.
Well, it may be.
Sometimes they don't list all of them.
You know,
of all those books, which one sold the most?
I have no idea. I honestly don't know.
What about 1,000 Days of John F. Kennedy in the White House?
Probably that did.
What year did you write that?
I wrote that in 1965.
And before that, you were doing what? Before you wrote that book? Right, you know, how much time did you spend with the Kennedy administration?
Well, I joined the Kennedy administration very soon after the administration began, and I resigned the day after Dallas because I felt the new president, Lyndon Johnson, ought to have his own people with whom he could work and whom he trusted. And Johnson persuaded me to stay for the transition. So I stayed for a few more weeks and then resigned and wrote 1,000 Days.
When you look back on that administration and you look back on the book that you wrote, have you changed your mind about anything that you saw when you were in there with the last 30 years of time between it?
Well, I wrote a second book called Robert Kennedy and His Times, where that came out a dozen years after 1,000 Days, by which time more information was available, and the perspectives had changed and so on. So that I think my mature judgment of the Kennedy administration comes in the second book.
What's the biggest legacy as far as you're concerned?
Well, I think the biggest legacy, I mean, there's some specific legacies, such as the Test Ban Treaty, for example, and the movement toward relaxation of tensions in 1963, the civil rights fight, which began in 1963, and the space, beginnings of the exploration of space, and so on. But I think the most general sense was that what Kennedy wanted to do is to tap the latent idealism of the American people, as FDR had done when Jack Kennedy and I were young, and as Wilson had done when Jack Kennedy and I were born. He believed strongly that that we were capable of intelligence, reason, and generosity in national policy.
Were you older or younger than Jack Kennedy?
He was born in May 1917. I was born in October.
Where did you meet him?
I'd gone to college. A college classmate was his older brother, Joe Kennedy, who was killed in the war. I knew Joe Kennedy. I was aware Jack Kennedy was a couple years later because he had to take a year out because of sickness. He was the class of 1940. I was aware of him, but I did not know him till after the war, when he became congressman from the district in which I lived and senator from the state in which I lived. So we got to know each other in the late 40s and 1950s.
What impact did the assassination have on you personally?
I mean, the mixture of grief, horror, and incredulity. It was a shattering time, shattering thing to have happened to a brilliant, capable man who was robbed of the chance of fulfillment of his life and of his hopes. And it sort of introduced a whole decade of, it seemed to one, of spreading violence of one sort or another, culminating, of course, in the 1968 assassinations of Martin King and Robert Kennedy. One had almost a feeling that this whole social fabric was unraveling in that strange decade.
What do you think of the current discussion, which says that if the media had applied the kind of microscope they do to the current president on his personal life, if they'd have done that to Jack Kennedy, that it would have been a whole different atmosphere?
Well, I doubt that, because, I mean, the current theory seems to be that everyone in Washington knew about a parade of bimbos through the White House, and that they covered up because they liked Kennedy or because the rules deflected that kind of inquiry. You read Ben Bradley's book. Ben Bradley was Jack Kennedy's closest friend in the press. As head of the Newsweek Bureau, he was at the nerve center of news gathering there. Ben Bradley writes that he did not know about these things. I certainly was not aware of any kind of waywardness which would interfere with the conduct of public business.
What do you
so
think?
I think it was much exaggerated.
What do you think of this whole issue as a historical, you know, discussion? I mean, is this of any value at all?
Well, I think if you're writing personal biographies of presidents, it's of interest. I don't think it's a matter of public concern. I think I think that the American people have reacted with a certain and partly surprising maturity to this question with regard to President Clinton. I don't think people deplore what is I don't think they admire what is alleged about his conduct, but they do think it's his own business, and it's a separate question from his success as a president. I think the adultery test, the year Gary Hart was forced out of the presidential contest, in 1988, the Robert Kennedy Book Award that year was divided between David Garrow's biography of Martin Luther King and a book by Elizabeth Becker about Cambodia. I was chatting with the two authors on this occasion, and we were talking about Gary Hart, and then it emerged that Martin Luther King, of course, was a man of certain sexual waywardness in his private life, yet he was a great moral leader and made a great difference to this country. Pol Pot of Cambodia was apparently a man, strictly faithful husband, a man who deeply believed in family values. All he did was to murder 1 million of his countrymen. I think there are limits to the adultery test as a standard to apply to statesmen.
What did you do in your work after the White House? Where did you go back to when you went back to being a historian?
After the White House, I spent some months at the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, and then was asked to be a Schweitzer. I decided not to go back to Harvard.
How long had you been at Harvard?
I'd been there I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts for 40 years. And as Thoreau said when he left Walden, he said, I greatly enjoyed my time at Walden, but I decided that I had other lives to live. And so I was attracted by an offer of the Schweitzer professorship in the humanities at the City University of New York. So I came and did that.
How long?
So I came there I was there until I retired for nearly 30 years.
What year did you retire?
I retired about a year and a half ago.
And are you writing a memoir?
I am writing memoirs. I was finally persuaded to write memoirs, which I guess I better do while I can still remember anything.
So where are you in that process? I'm
in the Second World War.
And how big is this going to be? One volume?
I doubt it. I'm afraid that it'll either be one long volume or two shorter volumes.
And when do you hope to complete it?
When I complete it.
Let me go back to your book, Hate Speech. You write about this in here. What is it?
Hate speech is speech which incites racial, religious, or ethnic antagonisms of one sort or another. And the question is whether hate speech should be suppressed. Now, of course, the suppression of hate speech would require an abridgment of the First Amendment of the Constitution, as interpreted by the Supreme Court. Justice Holmes once said that the First Amendment is not just licensed for the speech with which we agree. Obviously, there's no great virtue in that, but it's licensed for the speech that we hate. And to try to identify hate speech involves the whole, and to suppress it raises the whole specter of censorship. And censorship of that kind would be hostile to the purposes of the First Amendment. I think hate speech is hateful, but I think the way to deal with it, as Justice Brandeis said, is to have more speech, not less speech.
Let me read that quote, because I have that on the page before that, the Brandeis.
Yeah.
Did you ever know him?
Yes, I knew Justice Brandeis.
Where did you know him?
He was a friend of my father's. And with my parents, I visited Justice and Mrs. Brandeis in their summer cottage in Chatham, Massachusetts on Cape Cod.
And there's a school named after him.
At Brandeis University, yes, in Waltham, Massachusetts.
When was he on the Supreme Court?
He was put on the Supreme Court about 1915 by Woodrow Wilson, and he retired about 1938 or 39.
What was he like?
He had the air of an Old Testament prophet, really. He looked rather tall, impressive, looked like Lincoln in a way. He had great moral quality, great moral intensity, and he was a very impressive man.
Here's the quote you have in here, talking about speech. No danger flowing from speech can be deemed clear and present unless the incidence of evil apprehended is so imminent that it may befall before there is opportunity for full discussion. If there be time to expose through discussion of falsehood and fallacies to avert the evil by processes of education, the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence. I mean, we get into that discussion here about what do you put on a network like this, and almost everything goes. I mean, if there's a public event and somebody says some of the things they say in these public events that are, you know, don't sound so good to some people's ears, we let it go. Should we do that?
Yes. I mean, what's the alternative? Censor it.
Has there been a time when we have tried to censor things here?
Well, I think there have always been censorship with regard to pornography, to allegedly obscene materials and so on. And I think there's some point in that, particularly keeping children, when children are involved. I doubt that when James Madison wrote the Bill of Rights, that he had a Hustler in mind, or some of the semi-pornographic magazines. But I think so far as speech having to do with public policy or artistic expression and so on, we have to fight for the full liberty of the First Amendment.
But you write in this in regard to what's going on in college campuses and multiculturalism and political correctness. What's your take on all that?
Well, I can understand why college administrators would like to clamp down on abusive speech. I think that they have an entirely understandable concern for kids who come from minority groups who are insecure and feel themselves intimidated by complacent white bullying students. I mean, it's a very difficult situation for college administrators, hence the development of speech codes. Speech codes were a means of prohibiting various forms of speech. As a matter of administrative convenience, one can understand why administrators go to that, but I think they make a mistake. I think there are other forms of persuasion, including, I think the remedy, as Brandeis said, is more speech. I think the kind of, it's more of a challenge to college presidents, to college deans, to professors, faculty members, is to point out to the bullies and the racists among their students what the meaning of it is and what the implications of it are. I think that's going to do much more good in the long run than speech codes which infringe on the First Amendment.
You point out in your book that at the University of Pennsylvania they have a separate yearbook for blacks. What do you think of that idea?
Well, I don't think it's a very good idea. I mean, I'm of that generation which believes very strongly in integration and assimilation. And I think that anything which, I mean, multiculturalism is a fact of life. We've always been a multicultural country from the beginning. I think for a long time the minority cultures were diminished and excluded. But one of the great themes of American history has been the movement from exclusion to inclusion. And it's been a faltering movement. It's still incomplete. But yet it's a kind of persevering direction in which we are going. And I think insofar as multiculturalism means recognition of the minority achievement, it's absolutely essential. We should have much more of that. Insofar as it means looking at things in different perspectives. The arrival of Columbus, for example, from the viewpoint of those who met him, as well as from the viewpoint of those who sent him, That's very useful too. The problem with multiculturalism is when it rejects assimilation and integration, and when it tries to establish and perpetuate and celebrate separate ethnic and racial communities, then you are moving in the direction of Yugoslavia, or at least of Canada.
You ask a question here in your book. It says, can they be kidding up there in Northampton? And you're talking about Smith College, Northampton, Massachusetts. And you say the Office of Student Affairs at Smith College has put out a bulletin listing types of oppression for people belatedly, quote, realizing that they are oppressed. And then they go on to list, the sins of the oppressed: ableism, heterosexism, and lookism. Where did you find this, and what's it all about?
Well, I don't know. I hope that Smith has recaptured its sense of humor about these things. But I think it isn't lookism. How is it? Lookism
defined? Says the belief that appearance is an indicator of a person's value, the construction of a standard for beauty, attractiveness, and oppression through stereotypes and generalizations of both those who do not fit that standard and those who do.
I know. I mean, it seems to me the desire to protect people reaches kind of ridiculous proportions. Life consists of hard knocks and developing an ability to deal with them. I think the notion that anything that hurts or might be considered to hurt someone's feelings should not be said is a very dangerous standard. The insensitivity standard leads in the end to what happened to Salman Rushdie. Salman Rushdie wrote a book which the Ayatollahs of Iran regarded as blasphemous, as offensive to true believing Muslims. So they put a price on his head. The so-called fatwa is still operative. I mean, poor old Rushdie can't move anywhere without bodyguards. Well, that's the notion, the hurt feelings standard cannot survive in a free society. If we had the hurt feelings standard throughout American history, that would have silenced Mark Twain, Ambrose Bierce, Mr. Dooley, H.L. Mencken, and so many other people who've enlivened and illuminated American life.
Mr. Mencken is on your list, back in the back of the Baker's Dozen. Is it not the Baker's? Yeah, Baker's Dozen. I guess that's 13, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's not 12. And his book was The American Language. Now, would you have agreed with him politically on very many things?
No. Mencken was a great writer, and he was a wonderful, liberating sensibility, force in American life, particularly in the 1920s. He was a libertarian, but he was not a Democrat, in the small d sense. He regarded the masses of people with a certain scorn, if not contempt, and the bourgeoisie, he called them.
You say he seemed sour and mean-spirited.
In the 1930s, at a time when we were in the Depression, of course, he regarded all politicians as charlatans. He couldn't stand Theodore Roosevelt or Wilson or Bryan or Franklin Roosevelt, and he was very much against the New Deal and so on. So politically, when I didn't always agree with him, but I admired him tremendously as a writer and as a liberating force, and as a great champion of the American language, which he saw as different from the English language. He was a great philologist. I mean, he collected words and sought out their origins. And the American language is a fascinating book. He was a wonderful writer. It's fascinating compilation of the way that the American language had departed from the English language.
I wrote something down, speaking of language. I want to ask you about language, how much you think about when you write. The phrase I wrote down here was voguish blather. You say, I'm confident, let's see, the situation in our universities, I'm confident will soon right itself once the great silent majority of professors cry enough and challenge what they know to be voguish blather. How hard did you work on that phrase?
I don't know. These phrases slip into one's mind or pen or word processor.
How much time do you spend thinking about language when you write?
I think of nothing else, I suppose. I mean, I think about the precision of clarity of expression requires you to think about what you're trying to say. And I was a great influence on my life as a writer was a historian and critic of half a century ago named Bernard DeVoto. DeVoto was his history books, Year of Decision, Across the Wide Missouri, and so on, are still read. But he was, among other things, he taught for a while at Harvard, taught English composition, and he was a ruthless critic. He would write insulting and goading comments on whenever he saw something which seemed pretentious or murky or obscure. So it enforced on me a great concern for clarity and precision in the use of language. I use a dictionary whenever I want to get the right shade of expression. But clarity in language depends on clarity in thought. And one of the great virtues of writing is it requires you to think. Well, Dean Acheson used to say, how do I know what I think till I hear what I say?
What kind of dictionary do you use?
American Heritage Dictionary, I think.
And of the things that, you know, the research or the reading or the writing, of those three elements of what you do, which do you enjoy the most?
I enjoy them all. There's nothing more fun than archival research.
Where do you do it?
Well, I've done it in many institutions through the country, the Library of Congress, New York Public Library, Massachusetts Historical Society, Harvard University Library, and so on, Kennedy Library, the Roosevelt Kennedy Library in Boston, the Franklin Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park. I've even been at the Herbert Hoover Library in West Branch, Iowa. And time passes going through manuscripts very agreeably and very quickly. But I like writing too.
What do you do when you write? Where do you do your writing?
I do my writing in our apartment
in New York City.
Mm-hmm. On a word processor.
And how long have you been doing the word processor?
I have been on a word processor for 8 or 10 years, I guess. I think it's a glorious invention. The ease of editing and transposition and so on. When I think of the years I've spent typing and retyping the same page in order to get clean copy, I regard the word processor as a great blessing.
Now, as you're working on your memoirs, where are you in that process of research, writing, thinking?
Well, I do. I do combine. I mean, I have the research has been basically done. So whenever I enter a new phase of my life, I pull out folders and refresh my memory, look at letters or diaries, which I've kept intimately through my life. And memory plays a lot of tricks, but also generates memory. So you suddenly begin to think about things you hadn't thought about for 40 or 50 years.
When you kept diaries in your life, how did you do it? Physically, what did you put it on?
Well, for a while, when my handwriting was still legible, I kept it in handwriting. But the last 40 years or so, I've typed.
Do you have a lot of notes over the years?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what part of your life do you have the most notes from?
I suppose I have a lot from the Kennedy years, because I felt that I had an obligation as a historian given this seat on the making of history. I felt I had an obligation to note down things as I saw them happen.
Did you do it right away after you saw it? Every day, at night? Or?
Well, I would work often until 2 in the morning. I wouldn't do it necessarily every day, but nearly every day.
And do you have stories that you've never told before that you'll end up writing in your memoirs? And how do you, tell us how you approach a memoir versus, say, either an autobiography or a history book?
Well, I don't know the difference between a memoir and an autobiography, but you try to recapture what you thought at some other time in your life and how that made a difference to your life, and anything amusing or interesting that happened or people you met. It sort of takes its form as it goes.
Well, you know, a lot of people who have read this book think it sounds awfully conservative. Have you heard that before?
Well, I don't think it's conservative at all. It's a very liberal book. It's defending the First Amendment and so on. Yes, well, occasionally you get... I think there's a fallacy at the notion that militant multiculturalism is a liberal view. It's not a liberal view. It's really a view of the New Left of the 1960s. And if you remember the 1960s, the New Left regarded liberals as their main enemy. They weren't worried about conservatives, but the New Left and the radicals of the 60s were very much opposed to liberals. This is a book that most liberals wholly agree with. It's the aging radicals of the 1960s and their equivalents in the 1990s who feel that to talk about one people is injustice, and who want to perpetuate ethnic and religious and racial differences. They're bound to lose, Brian. I think the most telling statistics is the rate of intermarriage. Marriage across ethnic lines, marriage across religious lines, marriage across racial lines. More Japanese Americans marry Caucasians than marry other Japanese Americans. So many Jewish Americans marry non-Jews that people are worried about the future of a Jewish community, of a Jewish identity. The black-white marriages have quadrupled over the last generation, and the attitude toward what used to be called miscegenation has been absolutely transformed. So I have confidence that love or sex will defeat those in the end who want to disunite America.
Now, periodically, you've come out with a survey in the New York Times about the presidents of the United States. When did all that start?
Well, it really was my father's. Like many other things, I inherited the presidential polls from my father. He first, in 1948, for Life magazine, polled historians and political scientists as to how they would rate the presidents. And then in 1962, the New York Times magazine asked him to replicate that poll, so he did it. And in 1996, the Times magazine asked me to do the poll again. So I did it.
And then about a couple months later, I think it was the National Review came out with a poll by Walter McDougall, which showed a little bit of a difference as to how the categories. And one of the criticisms they made of that poll was that you had, of the 32 historians, only a couple of them were conservative. Did you read that part of the criticism?
Yes. Well, there were some conservative historians there, but not that most historians, it must be said, tend to be liberal. But we had Forrest MacDonald and some other conservative historians in the poll.
Why is it that most historians are liberal?
Well, I think because they see the necessity of change. Change is the essence of history, and therefore are more sympathetic to change than conservatives. If change were not the essence of history, there'd be no point writing history if everything stayed the same.
In your book, you talk about the African-American baseline essays. What were they, or what are they?
Well, they're a series of essays which were published some years ago as part of the Afrocentric movement. These essays attempt to show that most good things in the world originated in Africa. They talk about the glories of African kingdoms and so on. They're a gross form of ethnic cheerleading. They're rejected by most thoughtful black historians. But they had I think people of good heart, generous intention, felt that if this made young black students study harder, if it made them feel better, Why not use this as a basis for reform or changes in the curriculum? So that a number of cities for a while played around with one version or another of the Afrocentric curriculum, influenced by these standard books, treatises to which you were referring. I think the vogue is past, partly because of the leadership of black intellectuals who feel that this is not the way to deal with the question. Partly because there's no clear relationship between academic performance and the question of self-esteem and glorification. Self-esteem really comes from achievement. It's not a cause of achievement. It's a consequence of achievement. And I've never noticed that telling Greek Americans about the glory that was Greece, Greek American kids, or Italian American kids about the grandeur that was Rome, improved their academic performance.
What's the New York history curriculum?
The New York history curriculum, as a result of the Iroquois lobby, there's a section calling for making a great point of the alleged influence of the Iroquois Confederation on the formation of the American Constitution. I mean, you can understand the pressures of ethnic groups, religious groups, gender groups on school curriculum. They want to get their nice words said about their own past and so on. But that, as a result of that, is the corruption of history.
Current history, what do you think of it? Basically, the books you see coming out on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis.
Well, it all depends. Some of them are very good. Some of them are very hasty, superficial, sensational books. I think there's great appetite for history in the U.S. I mean, the success of Ken Burns' documentaries, the success of the History Channel, the success of C-SPAN, which provides a kind of coverage of contemporary history. I mean, a number of people, you know better than I, who watch Question Time and House of Commons and so on. All this shows a real desire to learn history. I think there's some objection to memoirs by people in government or out of government, on the ground that these are kiss and tell books and so on. I'm not against them. I think they enrich the historical documentation if they're written rather quickly, where the people involved, or people mentioned in the book, are still alive. They have their chance to refute or rebut or criticize, so that the whole process of publishing memoirs and other people commenting on them and supplementing them or denying them, all this enriches the evidence available for the future historian.
You at one point in the book point out that in 1900 America was the most literate country in the world, and that now we're 45th. What happened?
I suppose it's a decline of the public school system, which is a large part of this. The public schools were much more. The decline of the public school system has been associated with the decline of the city, and particularly the decline of the inner city, where public schools are valiantly still carrying on, but so often they've been deformed by violence and by pressures to lower standards. We're more and more a society that depends on the filling out of forms, so that illiteracy becomes a real problem. Other countries since 1900 have also become more literate, and that's another reason why we have declined in the standing.
Go back to your dad. How much are you like your father? I know he's not here with us anymore, but how much were you like him?
Well, I certainly have inherited many thoughts from my father, and as well as a preoccupation, obsession with history. He was a better teacher than I, and more involved in academic life than I have been. He was less of a political activist, I suppose, and less involved in kind of polemics and about current policies.
Do you have children of your own?
6.
6 children. What are the age ranges?
They range from 25 to over 50.
What kind of work are they in?
One of them runs the World Policy Institute at Stephen. Has written 2 or 3 books. World Policy Institute at the New School in New York. My youngest son, Robert, works for The Hill, the weekly newspaper covering Capitol Hill in Washington.
Was he 25?
He's 25. I have a daughter who runs a public relations firm in Boston, another daughter who's a painter and a teacher of art, and a son who's an independent television producer. Andrew did the one on Adlai Stevenson and PBS a few years ago. And a stepson who's an entertainment lawyer.
And did you try to pass on what you got from your father in history to any of the kids?
It's more a matter of the atmosphere in which one grows up. And I mean, yes, Stephen and Catherine have both written books dealing with history. Catherine, one about the Cultural Revolution in China. Andy's made television documentaries of a historical sort. Robert is writing current history, and so on.
So what's the best training for someone who wants to be a historian?
Curiosity about the past, and having good teachers in school and college.
And when you were teaching at the City University of New York, what kind of courses did you teach?
I taught seminars or colloquia in diplomatic history, and in one term in intellectual history the next term. I alternated between diplomatic and intellectual history.
And did you notice any change? I mean, you showed that the literacy in this country has gone way down, but did you notice any change in the kind of students you got over the last 20 years or so?
Well, at graduate school, you get people who are fairly qualified and who have a dedication. They want to get a PhD degree in order to teach or to write. And I had both Harvard and at City University, had very good students. I think that there's much less training in writing, it seems to me, than there used to be. I think the true or false exams in which you don't have to write anything, you just indicate and then you feed them into a computer, I think they're a menace. I think that people should be forced to write all the time from the earliest grades. I think clarity and expression and communication is the essential thing. I think there has been a decline in that.
Now, looking back over the people you've known in your life, forget the obvious, the Jack Kennedys and the Robert Kennedys and people like that. Who have you enjoyed knowing the most?
Well, I think there are 2 people, one American and one English. The American was Reinhold Niebuhr, the great theologian.
And you have him as one of your baker's dozen.
Yes. His book, The Irony of American History. I learned a great deal from him.
At Harvard?
Well, I actually met him through Americans for Democratic Action, ADA. But we became great friends, and I learned a great deal from him, from his writings. Another is the Englishman, Isaiah Berlin, who died the other day. A brilliant, sparkling man, high intelligence, wide range, great wit, great humanity, and a great historian of ideas.
So when do you find yourself connecting with somebody? What is it about those 2 that you personally enjoyed so much?
Well, I think partly personal chemistry, and partly that I learned a great deal from them.
And in history, besides Jack Kennedy, who was your favorite president and why?
FDR. I think FDR was a man who really knew how to be president. And of course, I grew up when FDR was president. His capacity to bring back a stricken nation. Remember that when he became president, a quarter of the labor force was out of work, couldn't find work. Our gross domestic product was half of what it had been a few years before. The banks were all closed, and so on. And his capacity to revive this country through leadership and experiment and audacity. And then, of course, his wisdom about the war. So I think he led our country through the worst depression in our history and the greatest war in our history. And that's why nearly all the polls end up with Lincoln, Washington, and FDR as our three greatest presidents.
And with the little bit of time we have left, where would you put Bill Clinton at the 6-year mark?
It's hard to say. I think he's a man of high intelligence, impressive technical command of complicated issues. When the spirit moves him, he has genuine eloquence, and the spirit moves him most on the most crucial issue we face as a nation, that is the question of race. On the other hand, he's made some decisions, such as the so-called welfare reform, signing the welfare so-called reform bill, which I regret. It's a mixed record. You can never tell until the opera is over.
And our guest has been the author of this book, which is in its 3rd edition. It came out in 91, 92, and now 98. The Disuniting of America, Reflections on a Multicultural Society. But Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rod.
Henry Adams. Henry Adams pops up in a lot of the readings that I've done for this show as The Education of Henry Adams being one of the most important books ever written. Why is it?
Well, it's a brilliant book. I mean, he's a brilliant historian because he had some extraordinary insights. One of his insights was the increase in the velocity of history, the rate of change. He talks in The Education about the law of acceleration. And we can see this, the movement surrounds us all the time. I think Henry Adams was born just as we were reaching the end of one great structural change in our society, the shift from a farm-based to a factory-based economy. He saw that. But he anticipated, not in precise terms, but in the general sense, this shift we are now experiencing, which is a shift from a factory-based economy to a computer-based economy. He did not know about the computer, but he knew that the law of acceleration was hurtling us into a future where things would be very different.
One of your baker's dozen is Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma, 1944, and you write a lot about that in the book itself. How did you marry the two, putting it on your list and also referring to it in the book itself?
Well, Myrdal was a Swedish economist who was brought to the U.S. to study the race problem. The idea, the foundation brought him, the idea was that he could bring a certain detachment and have a certain perspective which might be useful for Americans. And it's an extraordinary book, both in the depiction of conditions half a century ago, and if you read An American Dilemma, it's hard to deny that great changes, great improvements have taken place. We haven't gone far enough, but there's extraordinary change. Historians are worried about the fact that young Americans don't seem to know much of their history. And I say, yes, we are baffled every once in a while, but people don't know when the Civil War took place and so on. He said the trouble with Ireland is that they know too much of their own history, and they try to reenact it. And of course, they're filled with resentments over grievances that took place half a century ago, 300 years ago, back to Droyda and Cromwell. So that history can be a weapon in the sense of vindication of people's desire to get back at somebody else or to move in one direction or another. I think that one sees this in the construction these days of curricula, where the feeling is that people ought to be made, we ought to become proud of their ancestors. And so we get into a kind of ethnic cheerleading, which I think is at the expense of realistic history.
You know, when we sat down here, I asked you how to pronounce your name correctly. Why don't you do it one more time?
Well, I say Schlesinger. That's the German pronunciation, but it's a matter of fielder's choice. I can't even get my wife to pronounce it correctly.
But you point out, you talk about your father a couple times in this book,
yes.
And you mentioned Xenia, Ohio. Where were you born?
I was born in Columbus, Ohio. My father was born in Xenia. My father was a more eminent historian than his son. He was a great leader in the cause of social history half a century ago, history of immigration, history of women. He was one of the pioneers in the enlargement of history in what would be now called the multicultural direction.
What year did he die?
He died in 1965.
And what did his father do? Dr. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., author of the Disuniting of America, Reflections on a Multicultural Society. This is the third time this book's come out. How come?
It is the third time. It was originally published, Whittle Publishers, now extinct, did it in a kind of special edition, which was distributed free. And then W.W. Norton took it up, republished it in a trade edition. And time has passed, and the time has come to make some new points and update the rest, and hence the third version.
What's new in this one?
What's new in this one? Well, partly an updating of matters, partly some new issues have emerged, which I can tell you about, and partly because the publisher thought it'd be a good idea to have what he calls the Schlesinger syllabus at the end, a baker's dozen of books which all Americans ought to read to understand the country in which they live.
Let's talk about that. A baker's dozen, the dozen books that you've selected. Which one of all those is the most important?
Well, it's hard to say which is the most important. It's like asking which is the most important of your children, I suppose. But if pressed, one might argue that the most perceptive book written about America is still Tocqueville's Democracy in America. It's an extraordinary thing that, of course, C-SPAN has done fine work in reminding people of Tocqueville's significance. The fact that a book written 150 years ago should still illuminate the American character and the American experience is very remarkable.
You have Ralph Waldo Emerson, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Mark Twain, James Bryce, William James.
Changes in American life. But he also proposed an argument as to how these changes might come about. And he identified what he called the American Creed. And he felt that the American Creed put certain ideals in the minds of Americans, ideals which were imperfecly fulfilled, often betrayed by white America, but that in the longer run, the struggle for America's soul would result in an increasing fulfillment of those ideals. And also the American Creed provided means by which those who are excluded from the full benefits of American citizenship provided means by which they could carry out a legal and constitutional fight for their rights. It's a remarkable book.
You say in this book that the U.S. has worked so far. What do you mean by that?
We have held together more or less, except of course for the Civil War. And what I meant by that was that we are in a stage with the end of the Cold War where ancient tribal antagonisms, ethnic rivalries, and so on are bursting, which had been repressed by the Cold War, are beginning to burst out. And one nation after another is being torn apart by this. I mean, in the murderous form in Yugoslavia, where we have seen what horrors religious and national rivalries can generate. Even in a nation as tranquil and peaceful as Canada, Canada is on the verge of bust up. because of differing linguistic and ethnic traditions. I think that all this suggests that that you can push, suggests that we ought to pay more attention to what holds the nation together. We're living in a time of the breaking of nations for ethnic, tribal, religious reasons. I think one reason why I wanted to revise the book, The Disuniting of America, was I think we're more sensitive now to the need to find things that hold us together than we were when the book first came out. I think the Yugoslav experience has reminded Americans that if you press ethnic rivalries too far, if you decide that people belong irrevocably to one or another ethnic community, ethnic tribe, that may be the road to trouble, and that there is some virtue in the older idea of assimilation and integration. That is, we are, after all, Americans. The melting pot has worked unevenly, it's worked imperfectly, but it has produced the ideal of one people.
The first time this book came out was 1991, then it was redone in 1992, and now in 1998. And you say in the book that history is a weapon. What do you mean by that?
History is a weapon. History is ideally strives for objectivity above the battle and so on. But historians, like everyone else, are prisoners of their own experience, their own times, and the very act of the selection of facts from the past involves an interpretation, a sense of priorities, a sense of values as to what matters. So history can be a very strong weapon for people who wish to construct a certain movement in a certain direction. History, for example, has been the victim of nationalism often. What's happening in Yugoslavia, what's happening in Ireland. George Mitchell, who did this superb job in bringing about the peace settlement in Ireland, used to say that, he once said to me, "You